Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. Is it ever acceptable to have a game running at 30 frames per second? Something that no doubt those of you who play on PC have maybe asked yourself from time to time, but those that play on consoles probably notice less. Why would they notice less, one wonders? It's a difficult question to ask. In 2009, Mike Acton of Insomniac Games, the developers of Ratchet & Clank, claimed that a higher frame rate does not significantly affect sales of a game or indeed significantly affect the reviews of a game. As a result, they also then said that Ratchet & Clank Future: A Crack in Time would probably be Insomniac's last 60 FPS game. This is indeed true. The games they've released since then have been Resistance 3, Ratchet & Clank All for One, Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault, Outernauts, a Facebook and Congregate game, Fuse, and Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus. In a rather hilarious twist, no game since Ratchet & Clank Future: A Crack in Time, which, by the way, is one of their highest rated games ever at an average Metacritic score of 87, has actually received higher than their last 60 FPS title. Indeed, most of them got absolutely thrashed, with the exception, of course, of Resistance 3. The frame rate debate, which is about as hilarious as the idea of a climate change debate, or whether there is a sky yes or no debate, has been brought rather sharply back into focus as a result of the release of the next generation consoles, where I feel people had a certain level of expectation, having been stuck with very old hardware for the last 8 years. We got to the point, and we are still at the point, where games on the previous generation hardware do not even run at 720p. They run at sub-720p resolutions, and more often than not can't actually maintain a solid 30 frames per second, frequently dipping below that. That is, of course, to be expected. The hardware is very old, and they're trying to squeeze every last piece of juice out of it, and you've got to be fairly impressed, especially if you look at the launch titles of those machines, just how much power the developers have managed to squeeze out of it in the first place. There is a gigantic difference in graphical fidelity, and that is certainly to be applauded. The ingenuity of those developers almost knows no bounds, but compromises, of course, have to be made. The hardware was not upgraded, it doesn't get any better over time. You can merely figure out new ways to trick it into doing exactly what you want it to do. So, there was a level of expectation with the new machines. Gamers wanted higher resolution experiences, and gamers wanted higher frame rate experiences. Unfortunately, especially with the Xbox One, it seems they are getting not too much of either, with many Xbox One games running at sub-1080p resolutions in an era where we're now looking towards 4K, and frame rates that one might say were the same as the previous generation, but that of course would not be true. There were plenty of games that did run, at least in the early parts of the previous generation lifecycle, at 60 frames per second. And of course, what's the first thing to go when you need to make compromises to make your game look shinier? Yes, indeed, it is the frame rate, because as Insomniac says, apparently it does not affect the review scores, but the graphical fidelity of the game, how shiny it is, well, that absolutely does. Of course, Insomniac's study was hardly scientific. They themselves admit that it was a result of informal polling and various conversations with fans and other game buyers. One of the conclusions they came to is that only a minority of players notice frame rate as a significant issue of any kind, which, as far as I'm concerned, does seem to be utterly nonsensical. They simply don't have a choice in the matter. If you wish to play the latest and greatest games on a console, you will have to accept whatever frame rate they give you, because you literally do not have a choice in the matter. Now, the discussion remains sharply in focus as a result of an interview with the developers of the Order 1886, a forthcoming PlayStation 4 exclusive, brought to you by Ready at Dawn, which is a company that is mostly responsible for making handheld versions of God of War. They certainly know what they're talking about in terms of optimization. They got a God of War game running on a PSP. They ported Akami to the Wii, and yet as much as the God of War games are standalone on the PSP and are their own titles, they were still, one, inferior to the existing God of War games, and two, were not original IP and not on a next-generation piece of hardware. So, really, the Order 1886 is the first opportunity that Ready at Dawn has actually had to take on a big piece of original IP. And the words that are coming out of the mouth of Dana Jan, the game director of Order 1886, are extremely disturbing. In an interview with Kotaku, Jan is quoted as saying, 60 FPS is really responsive and really cool. I enjoy playing games in 60 FPS, but the one thing that really changes is the aesthetic of a game in 60 FPS. We're going for this filmic look, so one thing we knew immediately was films run at 24 frames per second. We're gonna run at 30 because 24 FPS does not feel good to play. So there's one concession in terms of making it aesthetically pleasing because it has to feel good to play. What? He goes on to say, if you push that to 60 and you have it look the way we do, it actually would end up looking like something on the Discovery Channel, like an HDTV segment or a sci-fi original movie maybe, which doesn't quite have the kind of look and texture that we want from a movie. Texture from... The escapism you get from a cinematic film image is just totally different than what you would get from television framing. So that was something we took into consideration. Oh my god, why? The fact that this is coming out of the mouth of a supposedly experienced developer is something that boggles my mind. I mean, that is treating gamers as complete and total idiots. Not to mention it's damn insulting to all the other developers that managed to make games that did look a hell of a lot better than Order 1886 does, and still managed to maintain 60 frames per second, admittedly not on a console, but you know exactly what I'm talking about there. Are you going to tell the guys behind Crysis 3 that their game doesn't look filmic enough, looks like a piece of sci-fi original movie? Perhaps The Witcher 2? Does that look like a sci-fi original movie or a soap opera or something from the Discovery Channel? No, it looks like a really, really good video game. Let's toss this thing out right now, shall we? Please. I've heard this argument time and again, and it is absolutely and totally nonsensical. Frame rate in movies versus frame rate in games is completely irrelevant. You are comparing apples to oranges. People thought that The Hobbit looked a bit weird at 48 FPS, and they might very well be right, and in fact I did see it. I liked it, but it certainly looked very strange. I wasn't used to that kind of frame rate on a movie, so things were certainly a little bit odd there, no doubt about it. But it's also a movie. It's not a video game. 60 FPS does not look weird in a video game, nor does it actually change the aesthetic of the video game in any way. It simply makes it look better, objectively. And more to the point, it makes it play better, objectively. There is not a game in the universe that I know of that exists, unless you're talking about perhaps South Park, The Stick of Truth, that would play worse at 60 frames per second rather than 30. South Park gets a pass. South Park had a very specific look that they were attempting to emulate. It is perhaps the only game that I would accept 30 frames per second in. Now you might think, well, there's plenty of other genres where 30 FPS is just fine. Fine, yes. Suboptimal, absolutely. You can play a game of chess, I kid you not, a game of chess at 60 frames per second, and it will look and feel better than it did at 30. You can play Hearthstone. I mean, hell, it's very easy to tell the difference. You play Hearthstone on a PC, then go play it on an iPad. Tell me that they are exactly the same experience. Tell me that one is not smoother than the other. The iPad version runs at 30. It is very noticeable. Now, you might be wondering how exactly it's possible to create a smooth-looking movie at 24 frames per second if I'm telling you that you do not get a smooth-looking video game at anything below 60 frames per second, which is not true, by the way. You could actually go lower than 60 and still get a pretty smooth experience, but the way that things work, at least with modern display devices, at the moment anyway, is that if you run at a frame rate which isn't a multiple of 30, you will notice significant judder on the screen. That's something that Nvidia's G-Sync technology and the forthcoming changes to the new version of DisplayPort are looking to resolve, to get the refresh rate of the display device down to exactly the same refresh rate of the game, and to be able to vary that. As it stands, a display device has a certain refresh rate, and it stays at that refresh rate. Now, if what's being displayed on the device differs from the refresh rate of that device, then you can sometimes get visual artifacts like tearing. That's something that VSync tries to resolve, but does so in a very ham-handed manner because it forces everything to wait. in order to sync back up again, which can result in input lag. Anyway, back to the whole film idea. The reason why you can get away with 24 frames per second is that each individual frame is subject to motion blur, so it is less noticeable. The eye can absolutely distinguish between the individual frames. That's entirely possible. We know that. That's scientific. But if you add motion blur, it gives the opportunity for the brain to actually fill the blanks in. And that works pretty well, for the most part, at least for film at any rate. Why does it not work for video games? It doesn't work for video games because you are not playing from a set perspective and you are the person that is in control of the character. That means you can very clearly notice when there is a delay in the game responding to your commands, to your inputs. That is called input lag. Now, in some badly coded games, even if the frame rate's very high, the character doesn't respond very quickly, and there's artificially generated input lag. However, with most games, when they're running at lower frame rates, that means that their overall response time is higher. A good example would be if a game is running at 60 frames per second, then in theory, your minimal input lag is going to be 17 milliseconds. However, if the frame rate is 30, your input lag is going to be 32 milliseconds. Now, that's pretty much going to be the absolute minimum, and the higher the frame rate goes, the theoretical input lag minimum actually lowers. Now, with a lot of modern televisions, there are a bunch of other problems that increase that input lag. So-called display lag can happen. This is particularly true when there's some kind of image processing going on with the display itself. A lot of LCD televisions do some kind of image processing after the fact, and that actually takes a little bit of time, a few more milliseconds, which it tosses on top of that. Upscaling, image smoothing, things like that can do it. And many of those televisions also feature a game mode which turns a lot of that stuff off in order to try and get the input lag as low as possible. But your response times when it comes to video games on console can actually get a lot higher than that 32 milliseconds that I was talking about, and the higher it gets, the worse the game plays. It's as simple as that. You want the accuracy, you want that input lag to be as low as it can get. That is why games play better at 60 frames per second, or indeed 120 frames per second. It is why people can notice the difference between those frame rates. It's not simply the visual difference, which is very easy to see, by the way, and I'll put a link in the description which allows you to compare 30 and 60 FPS footage. Unfortunately, YouTube does 30 FPS as a maximum, so doing comparison here is very, very difficult. But you will be able to see the difference, but more importantly, you will feel it. That's the real-world test. If you put someone on a version of a game which runs at 30, then put them on a version that runs at 60, I can guarantee they will notice. And if they claim that they're not, they are simply lying, because the combination of being able to feel it with the input lag and responsiveness of the controls, and see it, of course, with the higher refresh rate, makes the difference absolutely obvious. Let's call the statement from the Order 1886 devs what it is, and that's PR. It is making an excuse. Why would they make an excuse? Well, it's very simple. The Order 1886 is a PS4 exclusive title. Not only that, but Ready at Dawn has, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, worked with Sony up to this point. It is in their best interests to create something for the Sony platform that is a graphical showcase, because up to this point, is there really a game on the PS4 that showcases its graphical fidelity and isn't on another console? The only one I can think of is Killzone, a game which, by the way, runs at 60 FPS in multiplayer, or at least it tries to. It doesn't get there all the time. And that is becoming a big problem because people are starting to notice that more and more. Unlocked frame rates are resulting in people complaining about visual judder and various problems. I mean, honestly, I can't really disagree with them on that. Variable frame rate, at least at the moment, until G-Sync and similar technologies become the de facto standard, is very noticeable and does interfere with the gameplay experience. And there are arguments to be made that locking at 30 is better than having a variable frame rate. But locking at 60, at least on a console, is objectively better than both. Statements like filmic look and 60 FPS changes the aesthetic are absolute total puff. That's all they are. They are PR pieces that are designed to excuse the fact that at this point the PlayStation 4 is not actually capable of putting out the graphics that they want for Order 1886 to be that big exclusive that supposedly blows Xbox One's exclusives out of the water and still maintain a high frame rate. They've got to compromise somewhere, and this is a showpiece. If we go back to the comments that were made by Insomniac about reviews and the scores that high frame rate titles get over low frame rate titles, then what we see, at least the correlation, indicates that frame rate is barely brought up by reviewers. And that's a problem with reviewers. It does blow my mind that games that run at 30 frames per second could possibly be getting the scores that they do, but it's simply another indication that traditional reviews are fundamentally broken when they don't talk about these technical aspects. Reviewers are in a rather unique position to be able to hold developers to account for not only their actions, but the kind of things that they say. Watch Dogs got off lightly, despite the fact that the game was really not all that similar to the footage we had initially seen from E3. While it did drum up a little bit of controversy, most of the reviews didn't mention it all that much, and when they did, they kind of skipped past it. I spent a great deal of time discussing the technical aspects of Watch Dogs in my video, but admittedly I also make videos that are an hour long. Traditional wisdom says nobody will watch those, but sorry, my Watch Dogs video sits there on 600,000 views claiming otherwise. Too many critics and too many reviewers allow titles to get away with murder when it comes to performance. They do not discuss these aspects, and that in itself is ludicrous. But a counter-argument, can you really blame the reviewer when they are reviewing it on a platform that gives you no choice? That's maybe the biggest problem. Gamers on consoles are given no choice as to how to experience the title. They have to play it at exactly, and I do mean exactly, the frame rate, the resolution, and the level of graphical fidelity that the developer selects for them. There is no middle ground. And on PC, for the most part, you are able to alter that experience. There are some games that are frame rate locked, and that sucks. There are some games that are locked to 30, and when that happens, I call them defective by design, and I feel that is completely and totally justified. But for the most part, you can alter your experience on PC and you can't do it on console. And really, is there a reason? Is there a reason for that not to be the case? Have there been games in the past on console that have allowed you to choose your frame rate? Generally not. There have been a few isolated examples, but the closest you often get is either turning off 3D on the 3DS, which usually results in a much higher frame rate for obvious reasons, or unlocking your frame rate, which is actually available in some next-gen titles, but that doesn't get you to 60, at least not all the time. More often than not, it will float higher than 30, but it will vary, and as we've said before, that causes tearing, that causes problems, and many people would prefer the lower frame rate as long as it remains constant, and yes, I would actually agree that that is a better idea. But why exactly is it that console games do not include that kind of option? Why is it that we can't have a lower resolution and perhaps lower fidelity game that runs at 60 if we choose to do so? We can do it on PC. Are consoles really that different? Square Enix seems to think so. In the PlayStation 4 version of Final Fantasy XIV, you're able to select between 720p and 1080p resolution. The options menu, yes, it does have one in the PS4 version, allows you to select standard or maximum. Play the game in HD quality or play the game in full HD quality. It also allows you to switch on the fly. Their explanation for that is, hey, it's an MMO. There can be many people on the screen at any given time, and in large boss fights, perhaps you may wish to lower the resolution so you get a higher frame rate and a more responsive gaming experience. And you might think that that's unique to MMOs, but as we have very clearly seen in the most recent of releases, this is not the case. And there are plenty of games that cannot maintain a frame rate above 30 FPS, and the frame rate is all over the place. So if Final Fantasy XIV can do it, I have to ask, why exactly can't other titles? Why is it that console gamers are not trusted, supposedly, with the ability to select between a lower and higher resolution? Now, switching between 1080p and 720p does not guarantee 30 to 60 FPS. There's no doubt about that. It helps. Obviously, you're rendering at a much higher resolution at 1080p, so it takes a lot more horsepower. But it seems to me that we've got to the point where it would be totally acceptable and indeed reasonable to provide two sets of resolution options on a console. 1080p at 30 FPS and 720p at 60 FPS, making the necessary graphical compromises in order to hit that 60 frames per second rate. This is going to sound very weird, but I have a feeling a lot of PC gamers will agree with me here, especially those of us that own consoles as well. We would happily accept a resolution and fidelity downgrade in order to reach 60 FPS. And there are games that I want to play on a console, but I can't play them because there is this obsession with every piece of graphical fidelity you can get and frame rate be damned. Why is that? Well, I think there's a fair share of blame to go around. It's the level of expectation that is currently being set by the developers. It is the reason why people were so disappointed with how Watch Dogs looked at the end of it, because it was hyped up to look better than that. It was hyped up as the example of the next generation. The E3 footage was a lie. There's no other way around it. It was a lie. It was misrepresenting the final quality of the product. And you could say, well, this doesn't represent the quality of the final product as much as you damn well please, but that disclaimer is supposed to exist so that people don't look at it and say, oh, well, that looks rubbish when the game's not finished. That's how it used to be. Now it's a case of, well, the stuff we're showing, it might look worse at the end. And how is that acceptable, one has to wonder. So the industry certainly has a fair share of blame. Developers and publishers hype up expectations to ludicrous levels. They push graphical fidelity at the expense of frame rate, and not only disenfranchise a large group of gamers that can tell the difference, which, as far as I'm concerned, is most of them, especially if they were given both and asked to choose, but they also sacrifice the playability of their games, which is really why people like the Order 1886 devs boggle my mind. Game developers know the difference. They are experts. They know far more than I do about this subject. They can tell. I can tell. Regular gamers can tell. They absolutely know what happens when you compromise your frame rate. And yet, they are willing to claim that it's for the good of the game, or indeed that the game looks better at a lower frame rate, which technically is true. They're able to squeeze more power out of it, and make no mistake, that is the reason why these 30 FPS locks exist, because there is that level of expectation of graphical fidelity that can only be met by knocking the frame rate on the head. And then, of course, we can blame the press as well. These are the kind of people that will blame a game for having subpar graphical fidelity, even if it's running at 60 FPS and plays like an absolute dream. Games should be criticized for having only 30 FPS as an option. That is a real reason to say that this game has problems. It is only a standard because people settle for it, and those with the power to actually change that, those with the voice and the pulpits from which to preach, should be saying that no, actually, this standard is outdated and we expect better. And I think that that is happening. Slowly but surely, sites like Eurogamer's Digital Foundry are making frame rate an issue that people are discussing more frequently than they previously were. Perhaps it's also the migration to PCs, the fact that PC gaming is perhaps at the most popular it has ever been. Steam continues to increase in user base, with regular numbers of 7 million players logged in at the same time at any given time. And yet still, with all of that happening, there are still so many people that deny it. And that, of course, falls firmly at the feet of those that claim there is no difference, claim that it's impossible to see the difference, or claim, of course, that 30 FPS is totally fine. Well, I am not suggesting that people should not be allowed to play games at 30 frames per second. I'm also not suggesting that gamers that choose 30 FPS and a higher fidelity are wrong. But that's the key term, isn't it? Choice. On a PC, if you want to play at 30 FPS and get higher graphical fidelity, you can do that, and I accept your decision to do so. That is up to you. If you value graphical fidelity higher than frame rate, go nuts. Absolutely. That is your choice. That's the wonders of being on PC. You get that option. Console gamers do not get that option. And I'm willing to bet that if that option were provided, a fair few of them would elect to go for the higher frame rate and compromise their resolution as a result. But that's not what the games industry is currently doing, and that's what we need to be pushing the games industry to do. As it stands, developers like Ready at Dawn are making absurd claims that 30 FPS is more filmic, and that 60 FPS compromises the aesthetic of the title. Ludicrous claims that have a lot of influence, and really are only used to cover your own arse and convince people that don't know any better that actually 30 FPS was the right call all along. Call it what it is, a combination of inferior hardware and inferior coding ability. Is it their fault that they can't get this thing to run at 60 at such an early time in the lifespan of the PS4? No, at least not completely. It's entirely understandable that you don't understand the hardware yet and you can't get the absolute maximum out of it yet. That's cool. I get that. I don't mind. But don't make claims like somehow it's for the best. Like somehow it would compromise your artistic vision. Because it doesn't. Those are excuses, and those are dangerous statements to be making, especially when so many gamers are frankly uninformed on this particular issue. There is no frame rate debate. It is a non-debate. It is accepted fact among anyone that knows what they're talking about. The only debate that is going on is whether or not 30 FPS is acceptable in this day and age, not as to whether or not it is somehow on par or superior to 60 frames per second or higher. That is framing the debate completely incorrectly. That is ludicrous and is a result of both ignorance and flat-out lying by games publishers and developers. I certainly wouldn't accept it, that's why I play on PC. Console gamers shouldn't have to accept it either. They should be given that choice without having to invest a lot of money in a PC in order to get it. If you would like to find out more about Framerate, or indeed you just need to educate someone on the particular issue, there's a really good roundup by Linus Tech Tips that I've linked in the description below this video. It explains the issue rather succinctly, and does so in about 5 minutes. You don't come to this channel for succinct commentary, you come here for rambling. My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.